Hi, I'm Mark Harris.
And I'm Brad Guy, and welcome to Real. Tonight we look at refugees and sustainable immigration in Australia.
We take a look at a couple of short docos, one from Taya Granger about Phil Kayumba, a refugee from one of Africa's worst genocides, and one from Ed Painter about his friend Kudzi Mashonga from Zimbabwe.
We're also pleased to have La Trobe University's Chair of Political Science, Professor Robert Mann, join us a bit later on to discuss the federal government's recent No Advantage legislation.
Since World War II, Australia has opened its doors to millions of migrants and refugees. Since then, we've become a truly multicultural nation, with people from over 100 different countries now calling Australia home. Victoria has had a long history of welcoming migrants, amongst them professionals, tradespeople and business people.
The immigration issue always raises questions about sustaining our own national identity while absorbing new ones. Chris took to the streets recently to ask people what defines an Australian.
If you're not Indigenous, then you're from somewhere else, which got us thinking, what's it actually mean to be an Australian? We were sent out to hit the streets of Melbourne, but our car wouldn't start, so we wandered around La Trobe University and asked the students here what they thought. Here's what they had to say.
Believing in a fair go, cobber beauty mate.
Fun-loving and I would like to say accepting. Hopefully that's what other people would think as well.
Whether you have a heart for Australia and whether it's your home and, you know, whether you feel a sense of belonging here.
Whether it's out of choice or struggle, the number of migrants to Australia continues to grow each year as people thirst to taste the sweet nectar of Australia's fair go.
Just to be multicultural, just accepting everyone and yeah.
Most people would relate being Australian to, I think, connecting to country and land, regardless of if you're Indigenous or not.
Isn't whether you watch the footy or, you know, or things like that.
The footy's a good thing. I like the footy and eating pies and drinking beers. Yeah.
So there you have it. We didn't even need to leave La Trobe to get a response to our question, what's it mean to be an Australian? I'm Chris Hennis for Real TV. Back to the studio.
So what did you take away from those Vox Pops, Mark?
Well, we Aussies believe in a fair go. We're sport mad, we have a good time, and I guess we have a great sense of humour.
Well, you won't get an argument from me on that. So, did you have any favourite jokes from there?
The past, present and future walk into a bar. The barman says, "Why so tense?"
Ooh, a grammar joke. I'm impressed, Marky Mark.
As you should be.
Now, in the 90s, we increased our intake of African refugees, adding a new level of vibrant energy to our melting pot. Ed Painter introduces us to his friend Kudzi Mashonga from Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia in southern Africa. Let's take a look at how Kudzi maintains his own cultural ties while he strives to fit in to Australia.
Hi, my name's Kudzi. I came to Australia when I was 6 years old from Zimbabwe. My mom is part of a community, a Zimbabwean community, and we meet up, every now and then during the year, and it's just a good time, a good place for people to get together of the same culture, of Zimbabwean culture, and kind of communicate and kind of sustain the essence of our culture by discussing various things about Zimbabwe and what's happening, and keeping the young kids involved as well. I mean, I remember going there when I was a kid, and it helped me understand more about my culture. Having that culture and that respect for that culture helps you become a better person, because you always revert back to your culture when you make tough decisions. I communicate with my family and friends over the phone. Because Facebook's up now, I actually communicate a lot with my family over in Zimbabwe and the US and such over Facebook, and sometimes I even write letters. I mean, it's rare now because we got computers and everything, but back in the day I used to write letters a lot. Culture is sustained through a plethora of things such as fine dining. My mom still cooks a lot of cultural foods. I still listen to the music from back home in Zimbabwe. My mom still talks to me in Shona, which is our native language. But at the same time, I've embraced the Australian culture as well. And I love going to footy games and chilling with the boys. And I've been in Australia most of my life. So I think, it's not hard to say that I have both cultures embedded into my DNA. I'm I'm as Zimbabwean as I am Australian.
Nice work, Ed and Kudzi.
So, Mark, I've actually been doing a little bit of research.
Wait,
lately.
what? You did some research?
Yeah, mate, shock horror, I kid you
What?
not. Well, being lead presenter, it's just all about the fancy perks, the limos, the red carpet and premieres.
We get perks?
Yeah, well, I'm just the prettier one, so that's how it goes. But according to the tabloids and radio shock jocks, we've been swamped with boat people. Now, if you really want to see swamped, check out Lampedusa, Italy's southernmost region in the Mediterranean Sea. Lampedusa is a tiny island, 1/6 of the size of Christmas Island. And since the Arab Spring protests began in 2010, nearly 100,000 refugees have turned up.
That's a lot of refugees.
And now, according to recent figures from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, we're taking in 1 refugee per 2,000 Aussies a year, which is about 14,000 last year, both onshore and offshore. That means we actually rank 46th in the world for humanitarian refugee intake and not 3rd, like we're often told.
Yeah, okay, so what about the charges that these people are illegal queue jumpers?
Well, first, despite what sections of the media might say, it's not illegal to seek refuge. And secondly, according to the UNHCR, only about 1% of the world's refugees are resettled every year. Now, Mark, if you were put in a queue of 100 people and it only advanced 1 person per year, I think you'd get a bit impatient.
Okay, admittedly, I get a bit snippy when I'm waiting in the 12 items or less queue at the supermarket, so totally get that.
Well, it's still a very tricky problem. Nobody wants to see vulnerable humans ripped off by people smugglers or risking their lives in leaky fishing boats. Nobody wants to see any more terrible tragedies at sea. Yet some politicians talk about turning back the boats to Indonesia, a desperately poor country with a population density 40 times our own. Do we really expect our Navy to turn back women and children in dodgy boats?
Yeah, and then what's to stop Indonesia from turning back those boats that we turn back, you know? It creates this horrible game of marine ping pong.
Yeah, well, we're actually more in danger of being overthrown by cane toads than refugees in boats. But there's no reason the facts should get in the way of a good scare campaign.
We'll be back with more Real after this short break.
Mate, that's my line. I'm lead presenter.
I just wanted to try it.
Now we have a special guest who will shed some light on Australia's immigration issues. Expert in international relations and politics, Professor Robert Mann. G'day.
G'day.
Thank you very much for coming on. The first thing I really want to touch on is you got quite a colourful ancestry. Colourful, I mean, in that you had your grandparents fled the Holocaust and then you had your parents fled Europe. So quite a bit of fleeing. Can you touch on...
Well, that's not entirely accurate.
Okay.
My grandparents were caught up in it in different ways.
Okay.
There was no fleeing.
Mm-hmm.
My parents, who met in Australia, my mother was from Berlin, Germany,
mm-hmm.
and she managed just in the last few months before the war to get a visa to leave because of the Australian government, which was taking refugees at that time. And my father was travelling. He came from Austria. He was travelling when the Germans took over Austria in 1938.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a strange story because he had been born in the United States, in New York. The family had gone back to Austria, and he couldn't get into the United States. So the only country that would take him at that time was Australia. So my parents met here.
Okay. So how do you think the experiences from your family have shaped you both professionally or personally?
Oh, in so many different ways. And the main thing, I suppose, is that when I was a little boy, my parents didn't really want to talk much about what had happened to their parents and to their family. But the less they talked, the more curious I became. And in a way, the reason that I got interested in history and politics, I'm sure, was that history and politics had such a sort of huge effect and such a calamitous effect on my family and the Jewish people.
So in terms of the future, how do you see the benefits that Australia could receive in terms of increased migration?
To be perfectly honest, I don't have a settled view on it. I'm open to both ideas.
Still on the fence?
Still on the fence in a way. I mean, partly I think it creates dynamism in a society to have waves of migration. But partly also, you need governments to spend a lot of money on infrastructure. And I think that the cities at the moment, where people move naturally towards, there's not enough money spent on roads and basic infrastructure and housing. And I do think a rapidly increasing population, unless governments are willing to spend a lot of money on infrastructure, could lead to a deterioration in the kind of standard of the cities. So I'm on the fence. On the one hand, the dynamism of migration I think is a great thing, and I think Australia's been fantastic in its multiculturalism and capacity to absorb populations from all over the world. On the other hand, the gridlocked cities and the lack of infrastructure and the tendency of governments for the last 20 years not to spend enough on the basic needs of the cities makes me a bit worried about a growing population.
Now, Robert, how do you feel about indefinite detention on Manus Island and Nauru?
Well, there are two really big issues. I've always been opposed to indefinite detention in Australia, which has been a policy now for almost 20 years. And I've come to the position that given that 70 or 80% of the Australian population now wants offshore processing, and both major political parties want it, there's not much that anyone like me can say about it, except to say that it would be far better if the last 10 years of migration history had gone in a different direction. I feel actually a little bit defeated on this issue because I feel there's a certain inevitability to offshore processing because of the bipartisan nature of the opinion of the political parties, and because Australian people have in a way been led to such hostility towards boat arrivals. So I think there was almost inevitable that eventually offshore processing on Nauru and Manus Island came about. And my hope would be that boats won't arrive, and that instead, and this is what the government's committed to, a much larger number of refugees are accepted from all over the world. And that's probably the only way now where Australian policy can get back on the rails, I think.
Well, some wonderful insight there. Professor Robert Mann, thank you so much for coming in.
My pleasure.
No worries. And now we take a look at how one refugee from a war-torn Rwanda has made a new start in Melbourne. Enjoy Taylor Grange's fascinating documentary, Marugo.
Hi, my name is Phil. I originally come from Rwanda and I'm 22 years old. I now reside in Australia on a refugee basis, and this is my story.
Initially I was born in Uganda. My parents were also born in Uganda. They were refugees since the early 50s. And we moved in '94. And my father became a refugee there and became a part of the rebellion in Uganda to defeat Obote with the current president Museveni. And then after that they decided it was time to go back to Rwanda. When they did, majority left their families behind. So I went through the first 3 years of my life rarely ever seeing my father. And we weren't really that well off. My mother's an accountant by trade, so she worked at a bank shortly after she finished high school. And then my father went to Rwanda to fight. I went there in the last 4 months of the war and spent time with him. And once it ended, we simply re-established ourselves in Rwanda, and I got the chance to live in my country at a young age, but my father only got to once he'd grown up, and even then he became part of the politics. My
father was part of the Liberation Army at the time, the RPA, and they took over, and my father became part of the government at the time. Recently, the reason for my leaving was simply to come and study here. But in 2010, my father became a whistleblower against our government, and there was an attempted assassination, and they almost succeeded. They shot him once, and the bullet still lodged in very close to his spine. I mean, it's negligible. They won't take it out because they'll make him paraplegic, but they can't leave it in because over time it will give him lead poisoning. So it's a catch-22 once again. The main thing is that he's still alive. In Rwanda and outside Rwanda at the moment, there's this notion that Tutsis, which is the ethnic minority, are the only people who suffered. There's also this notion that Hutus are the only ones that committed crimes. But to me, we're all to blame because we all participated in that. Over 80% of our population is Hutu, and now there's a huge stigma of being Hutu. Even though the government goes, oh no, there's no Hutu, there's no Tutsi. We know very clearly if you're Tutsi or Hutu because people love to amplify it, you know? The main thing is they need to stop preaching reconciliation that doesn't exist because 80% of the parliament is Tutsi, 50% of that is Tutsi, this or that is Tutsi. Every decisive leader that makes a decisive decision is Tutsi, you know? If you're Hutu and you say something against the president, you're in prison. But then again, if you're Tutsi and you say something against the president, you're still in prison. So, yeah. You see, the thing also happens to be is you can't put luck based on just that genocide. There's a lot of people who, for instance, I had 3 cousins and my aunt get on a bus in 2004, and they all died in the same bus accident, and all of them missed the genocide. So you can't always base luck on a single event. At the end of the day, I think the concept of mass death makes you think about it a lot. And once you've thought about death a lot, you learn to come to terms with it. I'm less scared of death and more, not necessarily anticipating in the sense that I want to die, but to me, is if it does happen, it will end. And it's not something to be scared of. It's just like waking up or being alive. He is a bit of a miracle baby. When I came here, I just came here on the basis of being a student, you know. I'm only 22. I got here when I was 17. I was about to turn 18 2 months later. I lived 3 years, 3 years of my life here as a single guy. And it was all fun. And then one day I met a girl and we liked each other, and then whatever followed. And then we broke up. She went her own way, and she came to me and said that she was pregnant. And so I decided to go through the right procedures. And we found out we had a child. Then I had to make my decision and become a father. Now that he's in Australia, Sevlin is here and he's born here. At least he will have less of a chance of being in prison because of corruption. And he gets to grow up in a place where he can get proper education. It's been great since. I mean, for me, my theory is this: when I'm 40, he'll be 20, so he can be designated driver. That's the aim. While all my friends are dealing with their kids and diapers, I'll have done that bit while I'm still young, you know? So my later years will be left to spend having fun. But the problem with having a kid when you're younger is then you're less likely to have more. But he's great. I mean, he's a good motivation. I feel he's also a miracle baby because my dad was shot in June. I went there in July, and by September, I found I was about to be a dad. So it's like I thought I was gonna lose my dad, and then I had a son. Very funny paradox. It's one thing I undoubtedly feel is free in this country. For me, both Australia and Rwanda are my homes, because Rwanda, I was born there, it's within my blood, I speak the language. It's a bit like you're in Australia. But Australia somewhat nurtured me. You know, I came here as a bit of a kid, and now, it's not that I'm that old, but I feel like I've changed a lot, and that's all due to Australia. I have a tertiary education now, and I have a degree to show for it, and that was given to me by the Australian government. Not just Australian government, but Australia as a whole. Scholarship to finish my education, my refugee status, Australia. So at the end of the day, Australia has been more of my nurturer, whereas Rwanda is more of my primeval.
That was a wonderful insight into a refugee's life by Taya Granger. Great work, Taya.
Yeah, we were all very impressed with Phil and his little boy. I wanted to see how he's progressing here in Melbourne 6 months on. He kindly allowed us to catch up with him at home. Thanks for catching up with me, Phil. First, I want to ask, why did you want to participate in the Moruga documentary in the first place?
Firstly, I was a refugee and had become recently. So when they asked me my opinion, I felt it was important that I give it and perhaps give some insight on the matter, considering that a lot of people have a lot of opinions on the matter. So yeah, I felt the need to impart some of my supposed knowledge on the population.
How important is it for you to teach your son about his Rwandan heritage?
Very important. It's good because then at least he'll know the journey that's been made and somewhat give back, because if I could give back to where I came from, which is the reason why I came to Australia to begin with, I would, but it looks highly unlikely. So all the imparting of knowledge is in hope that he can go back and do something one day. But because I came here alone and I had to start my own life afresh, I tend to derive my family required doses from my friends. And for me, family could be a range of people, so long as they give you that support and they're able to contribute to your life in a positive manner. I think that's what family really means to me.
So Phil, a bit of a toughie. What are your thoughts on current policy surrounding refugees in Australia?
The current immigration policy is a little bit harsh. It's based on a policy approach rather than a humanitarian approach. A lot of people, especially in both parties, like to dictate about the humanitarian purposes of refugee harboring, but they rarely practice it the way they preach it.
Phil, big congrats on finishing uni. What are your plans now that you've graduated?
Work. Yeah, any type of work. I did HR, a Bachelor of Business in HR, and I did that specifically because I want to work with people. I like to solve conflict amongst people. So a majority of my plans were to be able to give back to the community here as much as I could back home. And then I think for me, I'm a big believer in karma. I think once I'd been able to help other people, then the rest just simply comes.
It's a really good story, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah. Have you ever seen Terry George's movie Hotel Rwanda?
I have, and it is chilling. It's hard to believe that could happen and nobody was able to stop it. Well, that's our show on refugees and sustainable immigration. We hope you enjoyed it, and thanks to all our contributors, especially Professor Robert Mann.
Till next time, it's a good night from us here at Real.
Keep it real, Melbourne.
Yes, got to do it that time.
Yeah, you think you're head honcho.
I think I'm pretty good now.
Next time on Real, we'll take a look into a more personal side of sustainability, human endurance. We'll be talking mental health, athleticism, and what it takes to survive in one of Victoria's more brutal cultural scenes, the live music circuit.